Parlez-vous français? For much of the history of what we now refer to as France, nobody who lived there would have been able to answer that question. Have you ever tried to read Chaucer in the original Middle English? Because it's so far removed from the English that we speak today, it's virtually incomprehensible. The same thing happened in French. Several times. Although I'm not an expert, I am a French major and a history minor, and so I've taken many classes in both subjects and done a lot of reading and research. I'm also a language nerd who hopes to get my master's degree in French translation in the future. Today I want to explain to you all a little bit about the history of how we went from Gaulish to the original French that we know today. So let's start with that first language that appeared in the region, which is Gaulish. The Gaulish people were some of the first inhabitants of the region that we refer to as France, but a Gaulish language didn't really start to take a shape until the influence of Latin. Because Gaulish was mostly spoken and wasn't really ever written down, we don't have many examples of it or any kind of record, really, of it. But fortunately, the Breton dialect, which was developed in modern-day Brittany in France, developed after the Bretons came from England and descends from Gaulish due to a small number of people in the region who continued to speak it after the Roman takeover. So then after that came the influence of Latin. And Latin was spread during the spread of Christianity, and of course Latin was spread as well. The people of Gaul adopted both the Christian religion and the Latin language. Gaul's location also played a crucial role in the evolution of language spoken, as over several generations the Latin that was spoken in Gaul really transformed and wasn't really Latin. This wasn't fully realized until the reign of Charlemagne, when the Vikings, often referred to as the Normans, invaded and then grew to learn that new language. After the Latin influence, the language of France shifted yet again into three regional dialects. The regional dialects of France were separated into Langue d'Oil, Old French, Languedoc, Occitan, and Franco-Provençal, or Franco-Provincial. These categories are based on each region's word for yes, which I think is really, really interesting. With Franco-Provincial being an intermediary between the north, or the Old French region, and the south, which was the Occitan region. This is important to note because the modern French language descended only from the Oil region in the north of France. This region was influenced by the Franks in terms of language, with the original Francia even referring to the land where the Franks lived. By the 10th century, people in France were speaking both Romance languages and Germanic languages with very little unity between them. So people from the north of France and people from the south would not have even been able to communicate at the time. There wasn't even a stable super-regional written language at this point, let alone a super-regional spoken language. We now move on to a more recognizable form of French called Middle French. Regional dialects dominated until the 16th century and the reign of King Francois I. In 1539, he changed the official written language from Latin to the langue françoise, or what many refer to as Middle French or Francian. Although France's written language was changed to the langue françoise, it was only a written language and thus only applied to the noble classes. Most people continued to speak their regional patois. Because at this time, if you were not clergy or rich or a noble, you were most likely illiterate. This rendered the language pretty much useless to the majority of the population. After this, we finally move on to the beginnings of modern French. The slightly more rigid Middle French lasted until the mid-17th century, when the Académie Française was founded by the important political figure Cardinal Richelieu. This is when the language really became an issue of the state and began to be standardized and centralized with things such as grammatical rules and pronunciation guidelines. Unlike Middle French, this wasn't just a written language, it was meant to be spoken. Standardization at its core is simply just the imposition of uniformity upon a class of objects. The object in this case is abstract, language. And in this case, the effort to standardize language was imposed for political reasons. Richelieu wanted to strengthen the crown. But it just so happens that in the years to come, the writers who are considered some of the great Enlightenment thinkers began to write in French. and these include writers such as Diderot, Voltaire, and Rousseau. Of course, the change from regional patois to French was not immediate. In fact, even by the 18th century, most people living in rural areas of France were still speaking their regional languages with very little French influence. By 1790, the first large-scale linguistic survey was conducted by Bishop of Blois, Abbé Grégoire, that resulted in the knowledge that there were 6 million people who didn't speak French at all, and another 6 million who knew a little, but there were only around 3 million fluent French speakers in France by the end of the 18th century. The rural language didn't change until after the Revolution. In an effort to strengthen the Republic and put an end to all things associated with the Ancien Régime, revolutionaries moved to crush the regional patois. Without the king to hold them together, the revolutionaries chose to impose French on the French people, starting from the ground up, with children. By 1794, École Normale for primary schools and École Normale Supérieure for secondary schools were created in order to train teachers how to teach in French, sort of manuals to teach teachers how to teach. This is important because this is how French spread, in schools, by children. The plans of the revolutionaries worked, and by 1815, the French language had spread considerably while the regional patois of France were starting to fall out of usage. As the generation of children first educated in French grew into adults who spoke fluent French and had children who spoke French in the home and at school, coupled with the dying out of the last generation who only spoke in a regional patois, it's no surprise that the small dialects began to fizzle out. From there, French became the dominant language, and it's the language that we still know and love today. In conclusion, this speech has given you a glimpse into the history of the French language. If you're interested in learning more about the topic, I highly recommend the book French Inside Out, written by Henriette Walter and translated into English by Peter Fawcett. You can get it on Amazon for a couple dollars. And if you can read it in the original French, then, that's great too. So just to go over it again, the language in the region we now call France has gone through several different linguistic shifts. It started with Gaulish, then moved to Latin, Old French, Occitan, and Franco-Provençal, through various regional patois and Middle French before becoming the standardized French that we know today. Merci, and thanks for listening.